Steve Minniear, Dublin historian and past president of the Dublin Historical Society, will talk about the Irish immigrants to the San Ramon Valley. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in the questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Creely. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning. Just a second. Hello. And thank you, Dan.
You're welcome. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm happy to come to you from Ireland House, which is the name that we use for the Consulate General of Ireland with our trade partners, Enterprise Ireland and Tourism Ireland. We're in a new building on One Post Street and looking forward to our next 100 years in this building. The Consulate General of Ireland was established in San Francisco in 1933 and we'll be celebrating our 90th year next year. And so it's within this gracious and very new space that I come to you today. I'm so honored to be asked to speak. And what I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes is immigration by the Irish to San Francisco, which is a huge topic and not one easily digestible within a 6 to 7 minute period. So please know that I'm really sort of glossing over a complex history and one that is still happening. One thing I thought of this morning as I was collecting my thoughts and my notes is that our notions of immigration tend to imply a past tense, that it is a thing that happened in the past. But of course, with the Irish community, then as now, immigration is ongoing. The means of arriving have obviously changed a lot, and the reasons for leaving have changed as well, and for the better, I would argue. But immigration from Ireland to California is a current process. It's still unfolding. It's still complex. So when I speak of immigration, I am mostly speaking of the past, and in this instance, mostly focusing on the years of 1848 to 1880. My family arrived during that time. But I'm really conscious of the fact that we still host immigrants from Ireland who come to the city essentially looking for almost the same things that my ancestors were looking for when they left Ireland and made their way west to what was then not quite yet California, even though they arrived after statehood, and barely a city. In 1848, San Francisco had about 200 buildings, all of them wood, and less than 1,000 inhabitants. And what people arrived to, often from the East Coast, often from Boston and New York and Pennsylvania, was a really hastily improvised city. One that it wasn't a city at all. It was a settlement. It was a collection of shanties and canvas tents, maybe the odd brick building scattered around the shores of the San Francisco Bay, which, as many of you know, I'm betting, extended further into the city than it does now. If you were an Irish immigrant arriving in San Francisco in 1850, you would have pulled into a muddy inlet, a shoreline that went as far west as Montgomery Street. And you would have perceived land that was far less than the land that we have now. It would have looked very different. And this matters because although there are things that characterize Irish immigration to San Francisco specifically, the questions of how does one immigrate and why does one immigrate and how was it for them tend to really focus on almost kind of the operational way that they came here. Was it by, was it by boat? Was it overland? Later, was it by train? But immigration has more to do with simply leaving a place. It has just as much to do with arriving. And the other thing I want to say before I kind of talk about San Francisco in a very specific way is that immigration is not a process that ends when you finally put your feet on firm land. Immigration is something, particularly with people who were born in Ireland at that time, continued to happen throughout their life. They continued to arrive and they continued to depart. One of the main tensions of being an Irish immigrant in San Francisco or Boston or New York or wherever is the balancing act that they had to do to firmly root themselves in a place and yet naturally hang on to memories of a place they left, typically under duress, and under very difficult circumstances. It's probably important for me to pull back even further than this and say immigration from Ireland in this period tends to really focus on people who were forced to immigrate because of the potato famine on Gortamore, which is what happened with my family. And that is kind of a primary frame of reference for when we're talking about Irish immigration. It's not the only frame of reference, and it's certainly not the only reason that the Irish left. I think as Steve will talk about, there were also Irish immigrants who left before the very darkest years of the famine. But those people who did leave because of the famine continued to arrive and continued to depart. This is almost a psychic state that is evident when you read the primary source material of people who departed from Ireland in that time. So when people talk about how was it to immigrate to San Francisco, or how was it to immigrate to the West Coast, a basic consensus is that it was easier. It was easier to be Irish and arrive in San Francisco. The conditions in the West Coast were very different from the conditions in the East Coast. And there is in general consensus that it was a different experience that they had arriving in Massachusetts or New York. And that for a lot of different reasons, there was just more ease of entry. This is not to say that getting to San Francisco was easy. It was absolutely not easy. And in those days, your options were confined to sailing around the Horn, which is what my family did, which was an often a totally could be very perilous, very unreliable means of transportation. You know, the ship's captains weren't necessarily scrupulous. It cost a lot of money. It could take up to a year if you were really in bad hands. And it was an undertaking that was rigorous and uncertain. And this is how a lot of people arrived in San Francisco when, as I've said, San Francisco was little more than an improvised settlement that was hastily assembling itself and that was contending with, after a certain point, an influx of immigrants, foreign-born and native-born, who were disembarking from ships every day. I think after the gold rush, there were maybe like 500 individuals that were landing in San Francisco every month. And what was there to really greet them? Not a lot. Certainly there was a lack of housing. There was a geography which was easier than the East Coast, but San Francisco in those days was essentially a series of sand dunes. The sand dunes marched from the west of the city up to Civic Center. The area that we now know as the downtown hosted huge sand dunes. There was a 200-foot sand dune around where Union Square is now. There was a lot of sand in the environment and there was a lot of wind. And this is the kind of physical environment that they had to contend with. Is this easier than living in Boston in a tenement with no heating in the depths of winter? It probably is, but it's still very difficult And another thing that really jumps out in the writings of early people who have come here is the persistence of the wind, the unpleasantness of having sand kicked in your face, the fog, and notably the fires that plagued this city throughout the 19th century. This is a fiery, cold, damp place that was very expensive because of the lack of transportation. If it was hard for a human being to get here from the East Coast, it was also very hard for a bottle of champagne or anything that had to be imported was also difficult to get. So this was the environment that that my Creely family experienced in San Francisco. But it was also open. There were also no meaningful controls on immigration. And importantly, there were no entrenched nativist attitudes towards people who were essentially refugees. So the sort of the Protestant hostility that they encountered in the East Coast wasn't totally absent here, but it also wasn't very concentrated. It was easy for them to enter in that way. And once they entered, it became a primary goal of theirs to begin to associate tightly, to begin to pool their community power, to be able to function as a community, because they perceived rightly that they had a unique chance to really make San Francisco their home in a way that was perhaps off limits for them in Boston. By 1852, which was about a year after statehood, there were 4,200 first-generation Irish Americans in San Francisco. And then by 1880, there were about 78,000 first, second, and third generation Irish, about a third of the total population of San Francisco. The voter registers of that period also show how this works in their favor. I think almost half of the electorate belonged to the Irish community or had been born in Ireland, and this is a way that they could make their goals and their aspirations felt. One thing that they did as an immigrant community to make their presence felt, to stoke the fire of their aspiration and to begin to kind of collect and harness and use their power, was to institution build. And this, by institution build, I don't just mean bricks and mortar. I mean media institutions, and importantly, I mean associational institutions. They immediately established newspapers. They established the social media of their day. This was critically important, especially in the wake of immigration. It not only identified them as a community, newspapers could also help you locate people that you may have lost in the rush to leave. I've seen ads in New York from Creelys looking for each other. They had lost track of each other. This is a way that they could re-knit together domestic or kinship networks. This is a way that they could keep in touch with each other. This was a way that they could let each other know where they were. Associationism is another thing, and it's kind of my particular focus. Associationism is a phenomena in urban studies, typically in the 19th century, and it means ethnic groups creating societies in order to look after themselves, take care of themselves, promote themselves, and practice their culture as a diaspora. The word benevolence occurs often when you look at these associations, and really, if you trawl through city directories, if you read newspapers from that time, there's an astonishing array of associations that cropped up in San Francisco almost immediately. Everything from banking institutions to charitable organizations to fraternal organizations to political and military organizations. One of the first most important ones for the Irish community here in San Francisco was the Hibernian Society in 1852. A man named Dennis Oliver was involved with this. Dennis Oliver is an Irish immigrant that sort of works against the grain, as we understand it, of the typical Irish immigrant being poor, being unskilled, not having many prospects. Dennis Oliver arrived to San Francisco from New York with his wife with a lot of money. And he continued to make money in San Francisco by opening a dry goods shop and selling goods to a city that were eager for them. And he ended up being a major philanthropist in San Francisco. He helped found the Hibernian Society, and then he later went on to found Menlo Park. He's credited as one of the founders. So Dennis Oliver is typical of the type of Irishman that was able to come to San Francisco and continue to make money, and through that to endow the city around him with institutions which were helpful to them. The other another important institution was Hibernian Savings and Loan, which turned into the Hibernia Bank, which many people in San Francisco who grew up had. This was just like a city institution that they and their families interacted with. It was founded in 1859 with John Sullivan. John Sullivan, who came early to California, I think in 47 or 48, and actually did find gold, was one of the lucky few who got here when gold was easier to find. And he, with 10 other capitalists, founded the Hibernia Savings and Loan, which turned into the Hibernian Bank. And it mattered because it became a savings and loan, an institution that was aimed at the immigrant community and aimed at rooting them in place by making capital or money easily and relatively inexpensive to borrow. They also would do microloans. I've seen the ledgers at the Bancroft Library, and they would loan, smaller amounts of money to people for not very much. And this is what would allow people to start their own businesses, to sort of start making their way in San Francisco. It was a way of settling roots down. It was just a very central financial institution for Irish Americans in San Francisco, and it continued that way, I think, until the 80s. The other associations that mattered were the benevolent associations. The Ancient Order of Hibernians is the best example. It's a fraternal organization available to working men, essentially, who were very, very well aware of the fact that this hastily improvised city was a physical hazard to them. I think when you look at the thrust of these associations and what they're really kind of about, they show a consciousness that life can be brutal and short in a cityscape that is completely unregulated, that can kill you in the process of you building it up. If you were a worker in a foundry, if you were a hod carrier, if later on you worked at a glass factory, there were all kinds of hazards for working men. And they knew this, and they knew that their chances of being killed in their industry were very high. And they knew that they lived with no state support. They needed to think about their families and how they could continue to root their families in place, even after their death. And that was the main thrust of these fraternal organizations, was to raise money for pensions, raise money for sick pay, raise money to pay for funerals, raise money to make payments to the widow and her children so that they might not be destitute. And unsurprisingly, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Rebel Cork Association, which is another one, Mayo Men's Association, they were all very popular, very well attended, and perpetuated themselves. Today, the AOH still exists. The Rebel Cork Association still exists. I just went to their dinner last month. And they exist more as charitable organizations in terms of funding other projects. But their existence now, I think, in many ways really speaks to the critical importance of them and the centrality of them to the Irish in San Francisco. One last thing I want to talk about before I switch over to Steve is just pulling back too from the conditions, the living conditions of the East Coast and the relative density there. No matter how cold San Francisco got, no matter how windy or no matter how sandy, they were very, very aware that they were in a newly open space, a space that was still so unstable that title had to be conferred on it by the state to San Francisco, a process which took a long time. It was unclaimed, it was open, it was slightly feral, but it was arable, and it had beautiful, beautiful land that was well watered. It had green hills that they could see from the peninsula. It had a beautiful bay, it had a port. They saw all these things, and I think probably immediately apprehended how good it would be for them to be here. I know that those are the sentiments of my family, who made a pit stop in San Francisco and then got out as soon as they could to go to Stockton, where there were the deltas there, the farmland is there, arable land, land they could own. I would argue that one of the primary motivations for any Irish immigrant coming here, many Irish immigrants coming here, was to avail themselves of land, because land is at the heart of Irish culture. It was then, and it still sort of is now. And the drive to get land, the drive to cultivate land, the drive to have some acres, especially for people who were coming from the famine, especially from people who were coming from land that had been divided and subdivided into smaller and even more unprofitable plots. This was a huge motivation. What they wanted was to control their destiny, which is what we all want. And if they were in San Francisco and they were standing on the top of Russian Hill or Telegraph Hill, you can imagine the vista that they had around them. And you can imagine that in the springtime, when our rains fall, that they could see the green hills of Contra Costa County, what is now Contra Costa County, and Alameda County, Marin County. And they could see all of that, and they pursued it. I would like to turn this over now to Steve, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is going to stick around for questions and answers with us. And now I'd like to bring in Steve Minniear. Steve, as a reminder, is the city historian for Dublin, and he'll have to identify which Dublin. I'll let him do that. And past president of the Dublin Historical Society. So Steve, happy St. Patrick's Day, and come on in.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here. One of the problems of being the second person to talk is that you get so caught up in what the first person is saying that you kind of lose track of what you want to say. So on behalf of all my Irish relatives, who I counted, and it's like 7 or 8 of them in my descendants, the Callahans and the Kirbys and the Shannons and the O'Keefes, happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that you're here. So I'm going to talk about a different kind of Irish immigration story. We all have in our minds who we think the Irish in America are or were. And we're going to talk a little bit about 3 particular people who made the choice to come all the way across the continent and all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to come live in our area. So this is the story of 3 people, but it's not the usual Irish immigration story that we talk about. So the usual story that we have in our minds comes to us probably from movies primarily and TV. You know, the usual story is what you see on TV, what you see on the silver screen, and what you've seen in the past. And it has something to do with stereotypes a lot. But the stereotypes is everybody came here from Ireland because of the potato famine, which is not exactly true. To be fair, the potato famine is not just an Irish thing, it's a European thing from 1845 to 52. But the Irish were primarily affected by the limitations in that they were a one-crop place. But nonetheless, Irish immigrants have been coming here before the potato famine and quite a bit after the famine. The other kind of stereotype is that all the Irish immigrants settle in cities. And we're going to see a story about some that did not. And then the other stereotype that we see all the time in movies, Irish, they're kind of a rough bunch. They're not the kind of people you want to live next door to. Not the family you want to move into. They're desperately poor. They're always drunken. They're lazy. They're good for nothing. Ne'er-do-wells. Or the other kind of thing that we often see nowadays is the mad bombers who are out to, blow something up. And a lot of these things come from things we grew up like the Bowery Boys for some of us who grew up watching these TV comedy shorts, or the movie Patriot Kings, or The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, or The Town from somewhat recently. Those are the stereotypes.
Hey, Steve?
Yes?
I hate to play the voice of God, but I think you have some slides for this, don't you?
Oh, do you not see the slide?
No, we see your handsome face.
Oh, hold on for the technical difficulties. And we'll go back here and we'll share the screen. That's right. One of the problems of having lots of screens open on your computer is you can get lost. So let's see, here we go. Let's try that. So, and do we see it now, folks?
We got it. Thanks.
Okay. So, Maureen O'Hara up on the right, John Wayne, lower left, the Bowery Boys, and on the right, the usual kind of cartoon that you would see about the Irish in America in the 1800s. So, moving on now to three particular Irish people who came to our area. I'd like to introduce you to Michael Murray, Eleanor or Ellen Murray, and Jeremiah Fallon. Unfortunately, back at the time, photography wasn't a really big thing, and Jeremiah we just don't have a picture of. But these three individuals grow up in County Roscommon in Ireland, and these images are from around the time that they left. So County Roscommon is a typical small farming oriented place in pretty much kind of the middle of Ireland. And they left in 1834, which is important for us to realize that these are some of the earliest immigrants from Ireland. They're not leaving because of the potato famine, but they are leaving because it's a tough place to be, and that there are other opportunities that they think are out there in the world that they're going to go out and try and find. So as you see, Elphin is the parish that they were in, and this document referenced up here, a topographical dictionary of Ireland, kind of gives you an example of what the Chamber of Commerce would have said at the time. Now remember, this is a document that's trying to tell you how nice it is in Ireland, yet at the same time they do admit there are too many instances of squalid misery in their stations and that are still there to be met with. And the stations relate to the small farmers and the farming lands that the individuals had. So Michael, Ellen, and Jeremiah. Michael is the brother of Ellen, and Jeremiah is this other character who just grows up in Elphin with them. And off they go in 1834 to California. Seems like a good idea at the time. So arriving in America in 1834, it's important to remember that it's not easy to get to. It's an onerous, scary trip. It's also important to realize that this is a leap of faith. These people are not necessarily young. I mean, Michael Murray is 27, Eleanor is 24, Jeremiah is 19. Most people only live to their early or mid-30s at this point. But they're picking up everything and going across a stormy Atlantic Ocean, possibly in this particular ship, the Marianne. But that was the method that you used to get across and going to America, where you hoped that everything was going to be better. Now, we often think about this Irish immigrant story of, okay, they get to the US, It's important to remember that the US that they chose to go to is not the US that we think of. It's not heavily industrialized, it's not built up. They're coming to another country in the midst of its own political crises. This is 1834. The conflicts between the free states and the slave states is developing into a huge, huge issue. America, the country, the United States, is relatively small. It just barely goes across the Mississippi. So it is this kind of wild, crazy place, unsettled, kind of exotic. But the choice to go either to New York, where they land at first, is where they go to try and start their whole life. Meanwhile, the little arrow on the bottom is to remind us that not everybody goes to New York from Ireland or from Boston. One of the other huge places that Irish people choose to live in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s is New Orleans. So they're looking for the American dream. And they spend a lot of time trying to find that dream. Michael moves about the country from 1834 to 1846, trying to find something that's going to work for him. Ellen is with him in New York until he leaves. Ellen, this is the love story. Ellen has decided that she is in love with Jeremiah. And after a few more years in New York, she goes down to New Orleans, and Ellen and Jeremiah get married in New Orleans. Jeremiah is doing pretty well. He's established a shipping business. The shipping business sounds like a pretty exciting thing, but when in fact he's corralling logs on the Mississippi and moving them down the river to help build out the city. Ellen is there and they get married in 1838. Michael, in the meantime, has not found his American dream. America is beginning to be mired in economic catastrophes for a lot of the western and farming states. So Michael eventually gets to Independence, Missouri. And on a visit in 1846, a very interesting thing happens. Michael, Ellen, and Jeremiah all decide that they're pretty much done living in America. They're going to go on and try and find a dream someplace else. So for some reason, we're not exactly sure, they all decide that they're going to leave America and they're going to go across the wide open plains to try and find something new and something better in California. And it's important, and I want to highlight here that by the 1840s, what they're leaving is a dysfunctional, economically depressed United States, and they're choosing to leave America. America, they're done with it. They're going to some place like it's either Mexico or Indian Territory. The record for these people is not really clear. We don't even know if they were going to Oregon or to Mexico, but they were going west. At the same time, 1846 is an interesting time because it's the first time that wagon trains become a thing in any meaningful way as a way to get across from America to what in early 1846 is Mexico. Of course, you have to go past the Indian territories and you have to go past the land that Mexico and Texas are fighting over, and you have to go to a foreign country. And we think that they went to Mexico primarily because they thought they could have citizenship in Mexico, and citizenship in Mexico allowed you to claim land, of which there was quite a bit. So off they go in early 1846 in a wagon train, in the same year and possibly at the very same time that the Donner Party is going across the country. So off they go. Now, a very interesting thing happens. By the time they've left in early 1846 in April, and by the time they get to California in October 1846, while they thought they might have been going to Mexico and leaving the US, they're arrived in California to find out that it is now part of the United States. On that whole trip across the Great Plains of the Western US, there's been a war, and they left at a country in peace and arrived at a country that was in war. And so now they're at Mission San Jose. where they decide to settle down in the newly conquered territory of California. They're there primarily to look for land. They're trying to try their hands at farming, of which they would have known quite a bit back in Ireland. They pick Mission San Jose because it's one of the few small towns that are available, and it's a good place to start. They next have the great good fortune of being in California in 1848 when gold is discovered. So they, at this point, pick up Jeremiah and Michael, pick up, along with many, many other Californians, including Jose Maria Amador, and off they go up to the gold country, and they get there in time to be among the early gold explorers, and they do pretty well. At least that's the stories that we hear passed down through the families. And that those stories suggest that the money or gold that they got up in Amador County, named for Jose Maria Amador, for whom they would be closely related for quite some time, they come back and they're able to buy land. Now, just a little side story. Family history and family stories are not necessarily a good thing to give you good history. The alternative view of how they made their money during the gold rush was that Ellen was staying at Mission San Jose, and she had, at this time, had 2 children. And she would cook for many of the people arriving in the Bay Area who were on their way to the gold country or who were coming back. So the other family story is that Eleanor was the one who made all the money, charging settlers going up and down, and that it was her money that allowed them to go on and buy the land that they bought in and around what we now call as Dublin. So they bought the land in 1850, Michael and Jeremiah, from Jose Maria Amador, who they had met up in the hills. They buy 1,000 acres with cash. They established their farms. And Michael Murray then goes on within a few years to do quite well. And in fact, he does so well, he's mentioned in a later newspaper articles as having 3,000 sheep. Now, 3,000 sheep may not seem like much, but back in County Roscommon, if you had 5, 10, or 15 sheep, you were doing quite well. So Michael Murray at least has arrived, and the Fallons have arrived as good farmers. Michael Murray is one of these examples of a story where if you're at the right place at the right time, you can make a splash, so to speak, in history. So Michael is there in 1850 in the area that we now call Dublin. At the same time, Alameda County is beginning to be formed, and it's carved out of part of Contra Costa County and part out of Santa Clara County. So it seems as though he was sitting around and someone says, hey, we have to have an election in this brand new county. Oh, we have to kind of organize this county. Hey, Michael Murray and a couple other people, why don't you set up the voting precincts? And in the process of setting up the voting precincts, they also decide how Alameda County is going to be separated. And they separated into something called townships. Townships were quite important as political activities before cities and towns got developed. So somehow, Michael Murray convinces everybody that the township that we are out here in Alameda County, Dublin, Livermore, and Pleasanton, should be called Murray. So he then becomes the namesake for not just Murray Township, but then after the Murray School District, and also some other things. In fact, his legacy is the Murray Township. Being at the right time, at the right place when there's not a lot of people, because in Dublin, in this area of Alameda County, there may be 50 or 60 people at the time, 1850s, 1853s. Michael goes on to be politically prominent. He becomes an Alameda County supervisor in 1860 and 1861. The school district is named after him, or named after the township, I'm not quite sure. And even to this day, we still have Murray schools. Later on, he moved on to San Francisco and became a realtor. And like many, many people, what do you do? Let's go be a realtor. And so he becomes somewhat known in San Francisco. So there are the wonderful activities, and this is what happens when you get your name all over the place. The Fallons, meantime, Eleanor is married to Jeremiah. They become farmers in an area around Dublin. It's another example of when there are not many people around and they want to name a school district or a school. It's like, who do we name it after? Oh, how about one of those early pioneers? So we have Fallon School, and Jeremiah and Eleanor are both buried at the Dublin Heritage Center in the cemetery there. At the same time that you realize that the Murrays and the Fallons are there, we don't need to overestimate the importance of the Irish in that particular area, like Dublin or San Ramon, which was also called Limerick for a time. We need to remember that there are lots of other families, and they're not just from Ireland, they're from many parts of the country. Sometimes if the only documentary evidence is this cemetery, you get this idea that, that's an indication of the ethnicity of the people at the time, when in fact, that's not necessarily the case. But we do have other Irish immigrants who come later, people who do in fact come because of potato famine. And then, so we have Teahans and Doubles and Nertons, and later on we get Scandinavian people who come over here, or Danish, or Dutch, or people from all over the world come to Dublin just because there's land here. So you may ask, in fact, I was asked just a few days ago, why are we having these Irish festivities out here in Dublin? Why do we have 10 or 20,000 people coming to Dublin to drink beer and celebrate stuff? And the reason isn't necessarily because of some huge impact on the community other than leaving your name around. It has to do with the stories that get collected and then the stories that get told. And Dublin as a town really starts to grow only in the 1960s. Even up to 1940, there's 200 people in Dublin. There's like 1,000 people in Pleasanton. There's about 1,500 people in Livermore. So there's not that many people out here. But in 1960, when the first developments start to come up, there are people who want to know, 1960, there were about 200 people here in Dublin. By 1965, there's about 5,000 or 6,000. Thank you very much for housing developments. But Virginia Bennett is the local librarian, and she takes the time to start talking to the farming community, the people who've been around, the people who have interesting stories. And the stories that she tends to pick up are from the one or two people who've got good stories, who tell you the story about the Murrays and the Fallons coming across in 1846 and being in the same wagon train as the Donners. And so that community in 1960s, 1970s are looking for stories to make a community around. And the stories that they choose are the stories that are told in Dublin Reflections, which have to do with many of the Irish immigrants. And those are the stories that follow on and get institutionalized, if you will, into great things like Dublin's St. Patrick's Day party. To some extent, I think the people in the 60s and 70s were just looking for a good excuse for a party, and what better excuse to have a party than to drink green Irish beer or green beer on St. Patrick's Day. Thank you, Virginia Bennett. So this tells a story about what we think about Irish stereotypes and things that are real and things that are not real, and stories that get told and retold and get ensconced in our culture. So yes, they were immigrants and they did come across the country. They came to America for a better life, and they found it. Even if they had to leave America to go to Mexico, which by this time was America, they eventually found what they needed. They started as farmers in Ireland, and they wound up pretty much as farmers or realtors in California. And it has a lot to do with that hardworking small landowner kind of story. But it also has to do with being at the right place at the right time and making a splash. So I'm still waiting for the movie about Eleanor and Jeremiah and Michael coming across the West. I don't think it's going to happen. Is that a great story? I don't know, but it's my story. I'll tell you one more story. So the story often comes, or the question often comes to me, why is Dublin called Dublin? And the short answer is it just kind of happens, but it happens in many different ways. It could be because there was a couple of hotels here, so there were two hotels, it's double hotels, Dublin, or because there were so many people staying in the hotels that you had to double up, or it may just be that, there's a big hill on the road from Stockton through Dublin off to Hayward and you had to double up your teams, or it could be this story. And that story is Doherty's story. James Hood Doherty, by the way, who is not Irish and would be very upset if you thought he was Irish. He is from Tennessee. He has come out in 1850. He made a lot of money in the gold rush. We don't know how. And he bought that that hotel right up there. And the story is his brother is visiting him and says, okay, this is Doherty Station. What's that right across the street? And the story goes, Doherty said, well, this is Doherty, but there are so many Irish across that road, it might as well be called Dublin. I like the story where he says, there are so many damn Irish across the road, it might as well be called Dublin. In reality, we're talking about there's 10 people across and 2 families, and they both happen to be from Ireland. But nonetheless, that's a story that gets into the book, and to some extent, that might be why Dublin is called Dublin. So do we still have influence in Dublin from Ireland? Yeah, we've got all these schools named after Eleanor, the Murray Middle School, Fallon Elementary School, Dublin High School. And of the 700 streets, roads, ways, and boulevards in Dublin in 2020, there are a fair number of Irish references, including Cowan, Carlow, Devaney, Donlan, Donahue, Emerald, Ball, and Finian, etc., 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 O'Ryan, Riley, Shamrock, Shannon, Wexford, and Wicklow. And if you think that makes it pretty obvious why Dublin has an Irish infrastructure and Irish references, that's great, except that when you look at the 700 streets, there are probably more relations and more references to Italy. But that has to do with what a developer wants to call his area to make you come and buy a house in Dublin. Of all the streets, and to end it on, my favorite street is still Gunshot Court. So thanks very much. I appreciate you listening, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulty. And if there are any questions, I'm sure Dan will direct them our way.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And Elizabeth, we can invite you back in, and we've got some questions for you. So, Elizabeth, the Irish that
Yes.
arrived in San Francisco, did they speak Gaelic? Did they speak English? Do we know?
Okay, so this is a really interesting point. So just very quickly, it's, I don't know, it's Irish. The correct way to kind of ask this question is, did they speak Irish? It is Gaelic, but it has just evolved that what you speak now, if you speak the native language of Ireland, is Irish. I was thinking about this the other day. Yes, they did. And they spoke it in New York, and they obviously spoke it as well. Yes, they came with their native language. They absolutely did. I know this is not my field of study at all, but I know that linguists for a long time have really wondered how it is that more words did not make their way into America in the way that, you know, Germany, I think, has impacted, you know, we have terms in German that I think that we use all the time. But Ireland is kind of a puzzle because it hasn't really impacted or given us words as much as it should, given the huge numbers of Irish who came here. Yes, they came here. Yes, they came here speaking their language. You can see evidence of this in newspaper stories. You can see the intentional introduction and use of Irish in the later activities of the Gaelic League, for instance, which in San Francisco, which was very well established before Douglas Hyde's visit in 1906, he was the founder of the Gaelic League. The Gaelic League is an organization in Ireland that promoted the use and the sort of veneration of Irish culture, Gaelic games, Irish dancing, the Irish language. It had nationalist aims, but it was kind of a formal expression of the idea that a land without a language or a country of people without a language doesn't have a chance of survival. And we had an active Gaelic League in San Francisco. We had a really big one, the O'Growney branch of the Gaelic League, which met on Mission Street, Mission and 20th. And they were very active. And you can see in Irish newspapers, particularly the Leader, which was edited by Peter York, founded by Peter York, the Irish, the leader of the Irish community in San Francisco, and his editor, Lawrence de Lacy. You can see them making reference to the O'Grownie League, and you can see people writing articles for the Leader in Irish. And you can also, reading associational notes, read of how at their St. Patrick's Day parade, you know, so-and-so would get up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance in Irish. They totally did. It doesn't, but it's interesting because it just doesn't make its way into mission culture in San Francisco, for instance, the way that Spanish does. I'm functionally bilingual in Spanish just because it's all around me. But Irish never had that impact in America. But they absolutely did use it. Did they use it transactional? You know, did they go to the grocery store and order their milk in it? It's possible. It's completely possible. Did they go to William Patrick Cassidy's meat butcher's shop, which is down the street from me at 23rd in Florida? The building is still standing. He was born in Ireland. Did they go there and order their beef or their ham or whatever in Irish? That kind of detail is really lost, but it was in the Mission District. I can say that absolutely of a certainty, and it absolutely was in San Francisco, and it still is today. I went through my Irish Studies program at New College, where I saw an entire play, Brendan Behan's on Geel, the hostage, performed in Irish. You know? But it's not like an everyday thing.
Okay, you actually both talked about the times that history sometimes is complicated and messy. Steve, how about Limerick? You mentioned the town of Limerick. How about that story?
Someday we will know. The short story at this point, based on the research I've only been able to do, is that Limerick has to do with some early Irish settlers or someone who at least either chose to call the one hotel there the Limerick Hotel, or the hotel got called the Limerick Hotel because the town was called Limerick. So if I can put, like, you know, call us back and ask us when we find out. It's important to realize there are so few people out here in the early 1800s, in the 1850s, all the way up to the 1890s. So if you get here first, you have little money and you put up a hotel and you call it Limerick, that becomes important. So where are you going to go? Where am I going to meet you? Where should we meet? Well, we can meet at the Limerick Hotel, and that gets shortened to Limerick. But pretty much by 1880, 1870, San Ramon is the term chosen for that area. So things fade in and things fade out. Just like in Dublin, Dublin was Amador for a while, Dublin was Doherty for a while, then Dublin was Doherty Station, and then it was Dublin. So there is an aspect of fashion and convenience to much of this stuff.
So, Elizabeth, it was interesting that you talked about this, and Steve, you had this really impactful slide up there about the immigrant arriving and continuing to arrive. And it struck me because at the moment we have an exhibit downstairs here at the museum on women pioneers arriving in California. And part of their story is, of course, how they got here, but then the continuation of that is what they found and what their life was like once they got here. And you seem to be able to suggest that once you arrived, you continued to arrive. And Steve, your story on Jeremiah, Ellen, and Michael sort of suggests the same thing, that the physical idea of getting into a place and then how you continued to find a place in wherever you was became important. I don't know if that makes sense enough for you to want to talk about it.
One of the things that we tend to get confused when we think about American history, especially the immigration story, is it's all about the journey. It's like, oh my gosh, they went across the Atlantic. Oh my gosh, they went across the plains. What we forget is that was maybe 8 weeks to go across the Atlantic. That's 8 weeks in your life. Okay, 8 weeks out of 1 year out of 52 is not much. It's a huge impact on you. But similarly, going across the US on the plains in 6 months, that's an epic journey. There's no doubt about that. But it's only 6 months, and you live in a place, or you move trying to find your place. And that's really where you spend most of your life, trying to make it work, whether it is in, this plot of land in Mission San Jose, or whether or not you buy some new land up near Dublin, or you start a ranch out near Limerick or San Ramon, or you move to San Francisco. Okay, no one really likes to tell the story of, milking the cows or walking down to get the mail. That's not what we remember. We remember that time we crossed the country in a wagon train. So, we are, in some regards, especially once you leave your hometown and you start to go someplace else and live your life, you keep living your life, and Americans particularly move many, many times. So that's, something that we do to try and find a better place. And it's not just moving to America, it's moving around America or moving around California. So that's the way I look at it.
And Elizabeth, the Dunns arrived in Baltimore in 1848, and my cousins did the history of the Dunn family, and that's kind of where, to back up Steve's point, that's kind of what they've concentrated on. But how many of the Irish, what was your family went to Stockton? How many, what was I don't know, how many people, I'm trying to get the question now. What was the number you think of people that Irish that had stayed in San Francisco versus went all kinds of places?
See, let me think about this. I have like a particular kind of emphasis on Irish associationism in San Francisco, and because of Irish associationism and its reasons for being, kind of an emphasis on working class and unskilled labor. What I want to say about this is so interesting. The arriving part. It can be very elusive. There are a lot of people who came to San Francisco looking for a thing, whether that was a home or an occupation or a cousin or something like that. Is sort of unclear, but some people didn't find it. Some people didn't find it because their lives were cut cruelly short because of terrible industrial accidents. Some people didn't find it because of their sort of innate restlessness and that liminality that an immigrant, and here I'm speaking of the classic famine immigrant who is fleeing from something as awful as the famine or the land wars in Ireland. Actually, that's another interesting episode that provoked kind of an immigration rush that they can't settle because they didn't really want to leave. So they have one foot in both places. I think it was Seamus Moriarty, the guy, the Gaeilgeoir who lived in my neighborhood, 100 years ago, who recited the Pledge of Allegiance in Ireland. This is sort of emblematic of that moment. You could leave San Francisco and buy a plot of land in Stockton if you had the money to do it, or in Dublin if you had the money to do it. If you landed here as an unskilled laborer and you couldn't get above that, you didn't leave San Francisco and you lived in the south of Market probably, which a lot of men did. And you kind of had to settle for that. The short answer is that if you can be said to have arrived if your aspirations are at least a little realized. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The Creelys arrived. Because the Creelys arrived with a trade. My great-great-grandfather was a blacksmith. They stayed in San Francisco. They bought a house. They had land. He had, all the stuff. They said they arrived because they were able to realize some of what they wanted. But other people that I'm sort of kind of crucially aware of, and keep in mind, these are not famous people. These are just people I know about because I tend to read old meeting minutes books and newspapers. Were really animated by a restlessness that just could not be kind of answered by what they could get for themselves in the city.
Hey, Steve, was that a motivating factor for our threesome here, Michael, Ellen, and Jeremiah? This sort of wanderlust kind of thing?
I don't think there is that aspect of wanderlust. I think there's more. I mean, remember, these are real, regular people. They're like us. So it's like, are you happy where you are, or do you want to try something else? Now, you have to be fundamentally very, very unhappy with your circumstance to leave your country. And it has to be so bad that you take up and leave a country and go across an ocean and go someplace else to try and start. I don't think we should ever underestimate just how difficult it is to be an immigrant. But, you know, you make a decision and then you get someplace and you decide, well, this is great, or it's better, but I may want to find something else. The other thing is, I think we need to realize that chance happens with all of our lives. So you get to New York and you have a bad experience and you leave, or you have a good experience, or you have a bad experience in New Orleans, like Jeremiah must have had a good time, or it's something changes and then you have to move on. So I don't think it's a wanderlust. I think it's one of the things about immigrants is that they've made a huge choice to leave, to go someplace else. They're aware that those opportunities exist, much more to some extent than we do. I mean, once you've moved someplace, you can move again if you want to, if it's convenient, if it's practicable. You've done it. So I think these people that I'm talking about, you know, found eventually things that they wanted. Michael Murray is a good example. You know, they have a township named after him, the school district is named after him, and he still leaves to go to San Francisco. And I think that has to do, you know, with ambition. It has to do with the circumstances that are going on in Dublin and San Ramon at the time. And it's, you know, maybe a little bit of greed. But chance happens, and we shouldn't underestimate that.
Okay. Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun, but I know I'm keeping you from a good chunk of the rest of your day. And so I think I'd like to thank you for both coming on. Elizabeth, thank you in the Irish Consulate for agreeing to be on this with us. Steve, it's always a pleasure to have you on. And I'd like to thank everyone for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, and you can find them by going to our museum website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Join us next month, April 21st at 11:30. We're keeping the Irish tradition alive. Steve mentioned the Doherty family, and museum past president and local historian Beverly Lane will tell us the history and influence of the Doherty family in the Valley. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. Museums also need volunteers. If you can give us some time, please contact us. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you to Elizabeth and Steve. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Stay
Happy
safe.
St. Patrick's Day.
And
Thank you very much, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.